Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening in to the first of your two myON webinars. What we're going to be doing in today's session is we're going to be providing you with a really brief overview of myON, just so you guys get an idea as to how to use the system. And also we're going to give you a really quick introduction into a couple of the reports that are available for you as teachers in terms of tracking how your students are performing in myON. So hopefully after you've watched this first session, you should feel quite happy launching this with your students. So if we start with the really short overview first. So myON is essentially a digital platform which is going to allow your students unlimited access to thousands of enhanced digital ebooks. What is absolutely fantastic about myON is not only do your students have access to all of these books, but they are also going to get personalised recommendations. Now, these are going to be based on the grade level that your students are entered into the system in. They're also going to be based on their reading level or their Lexile level, which I'll go through in more detail in a second, which is essentially their ability in reading and comprehending in English, and also the kind of topics that they are interested in, which is a really nice way to really push that reading for pleasure in another language. Now, the best thing I think about myON, which your students are going to have, is the majority of the books on myON are going to have an audio feature, which means that the entire book can be read aloud to your students. So not only are they going to have the support from yourselves as an English teacher, when you guys aren't there, you're essentially sending them home with an English teacher in their pocket. Because if they don't have that level of English or that level of support at home, they're still going to be able to hear the English language read aloud to them. Now, I mentioned that they get unlimited access to the site because they are able to access myON 24/7. So as I've just mentioned, they don't only get access to the system in school, but they can access it at home as well. So you know they are going to be fully immersed in that English language learning. And as we'll explore a little bit more in the second webinar, there are ways that they can go beyond just that listening to really interact with those books to help them with the other skills that come with learning a language. Now, with myON, when they access it online, they are going to get the full experience. So they're going to be able to see everything that we're going to be looking at over the course of these two sessions. And it can be accessed online through computers, laptops, iPads, tablets, and even mobile phones. Although I would say that the mobile phone screen can sometimes be a little bit small and not necessarily give them the best interaction with the books. However, we appreciate that some students may not necessarily always have access to the internet or to Wi-Fi, so there is actually an app available where students can still use the system offline. So for iPads, tablets, the Google Chrome app. Now, with the app, what the students are able to do is to download and store up to 20 books at a time. Now, they don't get the full interaction with the books that they do in the online feature, but they will still have that audio narration. So if your students are going on holiday, they're abroad, they may be traveling somewhere, commute to school, they are still going to have that audio narration and be fully immersed in these books. Now, of course, as English language teachers, we know how important that audio option is in terms of learning a language, because actually listening is such an important skill. Because as we can see based on the image that we have on the screen, we can't necessarily expect a student to improve in speaking, in reading, or even writing words if they've never actually heard them pronounced correctly, which is where myON is going to offer them that 24/7 support. Now, there's different ways in which myON can be accessed through the login options. So for yourselves as teachers, you will be using the faculty option. Now, this is going to allow you to log in and analyze your students' data. So see how much they're reading, when they're reading. You're also going to be able to share books with them and also set them pieces of homework for those that are a little bit further ahead in their journey with myON. We also have the student login, which is what we're going to look at first today, which is not only going to allow them to have access to all of these books, but it's going to allow them to see when they are actually reading, what times of the day, how much time they are actually spending in myON, which is going to really promote that reading for pleasure. Now, when your students log in for the very first time, the first thing that they are going to see is the interest inventory. Now, this is just there to help with those recommendations. The view is going to differ ever so slightly depending on the year group. So for your younger students, they are going to get the view on the left-hand side. And for your slightly older students, they get the more grown-up view on the right-hand side. This just allows them to rate certain topics. So it could be that they really love science, but they really dislike maths. Of course, the system is going to recommend books based on this. But don't worry, this is something that they can come back and change at a later date as they start to build up more of a profile of themselves as readers and they begin to develop things or topics that they're interested in. So that's the first way books that can be recommended. As I mentioned, they're also going to be recommended based on the student's reading ability. Now, the way that we get this very first starting level is through something called a placement exam. Now, this is just there for the very first time that they log into myON. And it is incredibly important that your students take this assessment independently and they don't have any help from, say, parents or older siblings. Now, the reason for that is if somebody else completes it on that student's behalf and they potentially do very well, but that doesn't actually reflect your students' reading levels, then the system is going to be recommending books that are far too difficult for the child. And actually, this is where the student is going to become frustrated because they can't read books or comprehend books that are in their recommended section. Just going to be much easier and better for that child if it is taken independently. Now, the test is going to be up to 35 questions and is going to look a little bit like the images on the screen. Now, the reason why it is up to 35 questions is if a student gets 4 questions incorrect in a row, the system will then just kick them out, just so that student does not become frustrated with the test because they don't have the level of English required. So again, it's not an issue for them taking it independently. Now, when this test has been completed, the students are going to be given a Lexile level, which shows you their comprehension in English. Now, the Lexile level is going to be represented with a number followed by the letter L. as you can see with the scale that we have on the left-hand side of the screen. So every learner will have an individual number, and also every book is also going to have a Lexile level, which is taking into account the complexity of that text, so how difficult that book is. It's a really nice way to match the learner with the right books. Now, what we would say is the sweet spot for reading comprehension is if a student is reading books that are between 100 Lexile levels below and 50 Lexile levels above the figure that they receive from this test. So, for example, if I had a score of 200L, the books that are best for me are between a Lexile of 100L and 250L. That's my sweet spot. Now, as you'll notice, we have some scores that come in below a Lexile level of 0. These are going to be for those really young students or those that are very early in their English language learning journey. Now, we obviously don't want to represent a negative number for these students. So what happens instead is they will have BR at the beginning, which stands for beginning reader. It just shows you that this is somebody that is going to need potentially quite a lot of support with these books, or they're going to be accessing very low level texts. But of course, they're going to be able to see this improve as they move through their myON journey. So as we mentioned, very first Lexile level is going to be from that placement test, which is only taken once. But of course, as they're taught more English, they're learning more words through their lessons and through these books on myON, we're going to start to see their levels change. So this is where the benchmarks come in. Now, these benchmarks are going to be for the students after they have completed 3 hours of reading on myON, or they have completed 5 books from beginning to end, whichever one comes first. But don't worry if you get students that are logging into myON every day and are doing a lot of reading, they're not going to be any more than every 2 weeks. So maximum would be 2 every month, because of course we don't want to over test students. But from a student's dashboard, they are going to be able to tell themselves if they have these benchmarks available through the inclusion of a little purple envelope, which means that they have myON mail. Quite a fun thing for the students to see. Now, based on the images you have on the screen, you'll see it looks slightly different to that placement test. This is going to be a few more pictures or a gap fill. So it doesn't feel quite as much of an assessment as that placement test would have done. But for the students, from their home page, when they click onto their name and then click onto the Lexile tab, they can actually themselves see how their Lexile has begun to change as they start reading more. Because of course, as you're learning a new language, it can be incredibly difficult to know if your level is actually improving. This lets the students see themselves as they start to grow and really build up that new language acquisition through each of these benchmark tests. And of course, if maybe they don't do particularly well from one to another, they can see maybe if they haven't done as much reading that month, for example. So what we're going to do now is we're going to log on to the actual myON site itself, just so you can see what that student dashboard is going to look like, and we're also going to have a look at the audio feature available within a book. So I'm just going to get the myON site up for you. So if you just bear with me 1 second. Okay, and you should be able to see on your screen the myON website. So this is just by going to myon.com. Now, what is really nice with this myon.com home screen is that actually we can see how many books are being read right now, as well as within the last 30 days. That allows your students to see that actually they are part of a global community of readers. But they would just need to click onto myON login, type in the name of their school and select it from the drop down list, and then put in their individual login details. And as you can see, first of all, we have these interests to fill in. So I've gone in as a slightly younger student with the smiley faces. And as we talked about, it could be that science is something that I really enjoy, it's something that I want to read more books on, whereas maths, I really don't like. But once they have rated each of these particular categories, they then save at the top, and they are going straight into that placement test. So I'm going to get the first couple right. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the next few questions wrong, so you can see how this is actually changing for the student, but also is not going to leave them in a frustrated position and having to complete 35 questions of something they just find too difficult. So I've got one wrong, I've got another one wrong, a third one wrong, and on that fourth one that I've got incorrectly, it has just kicked me out of this test. So again, as you can see, it's not something that the parents need to be involved in. I've now got my unique Lexile level, which lets me know what books I can access. And of course, I can start to see that change as I start using the system and start taking these benchmark assessments. But at the top, I can now see exactly what my Lexile level is, as well as the fact that I am that beginning reader. Okay. Now, before we go into a book, you'll see that the students themselves have this dashboard, which includes a reader meter, which allows them to track exactly how long they are spending on myON. Again, the view is going to look a little bit more grown up for your slightly older students, but we can track how much time we're spending, books we've finished, and pages we've read over a week or a month. But I'm just going to click onto library at the top. And as we have talked about a lot today, you'll see that I now have the recommended tab. And of course, this is going to keep changing the more books that I am actually accessing on myON as well. So it's always going to be intuitive and know me as a reader. But this is really interactive for the students. Kind of has a little bit of a Netflix vibe, you might say, as it allows me to scroll through and find a book that interests me. And actually, for some of your students, this is going to be a really good place to start if maybe they're not quite sure what they would like to read in English. But I can scroll down, and if I don't find anything that I like, again, I can go in and I can look based on another topic as well. But you can see how we don't want the books that are recommended here to be too difficult for that child. Okay. There are other ways in which they can search as well. So this is where potentially we might want to be linking in with other subjects, for example. So we can still practice English in, say, science, history, geography. the students can browse for books and look based on a topic that might interest them or something that they're learning about in class. So science, for example. And it could be that we want to do space because that's a topic that we're being taught. Or we can just come in and search for something specific. So it could be that I really love sharks and I want to see every book on the system that is to do with that particular topic. But it can be filtered down as well. So I can search based on my Lexile and I can see the best Lexile for me. And I can also filter based on my grade level as well. So I'm just going to search for a particular book. And you can see I just type it in, click the magnifying glass, and then I get the list of all of the books that are available to me. When I hover over that book, I can see information about that book if I would like. So a brief overview, the Lexile level, grade levels. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I am going to read this book. And with the audio, they have control of this over the bottom. So I'm just going to click play.
If You Were an Adjective by Michael Dahl, illustrated by Sarah Gray.
And as we talked about, this is so fantastic for the students to have the English read aloud to them. And this is voice actors that have recorded this. So it's going to give them the correct intonation as well. So it will always sound like natural speech. So I'm just going to turn the page.
Looking for adjectives? Watch for the big, colorful words in the example sentences.
If you were an adjective, you would be colorful, brilliant, dazzling, feathery, many-legged, slimy.
Just going to pause that at the bottom, but you can see as well that it is designed to be a very interactive experience for the students as well. Now, under the settings tab, they can actually control the audio speed as well, because actually, as they're first being introduced to English, potentially the pace of that may be a little bit too quick. So it could be that actually they just want to slow that down a little bit. So if I play that again.
If you were an adjective, you would work side by side.
So you'll notice that it is just a slightly slower pace. The other thing with that audio is you'll notice that it is also highlighting the words and the sentences as we are going through. So again, for some students, the very first time they're exposed to these books, they can just listen and follow along as it's being read to them. And of course, they can keep clicking play and play this page again and again and again if they just want to get the correct pronunciation. As they move slightly further ahead in their language learning, again, under settings, they can actually control the way that that is highlighted. So they might think, actually, at this point, I don't want to have the individual words highlighted. I just want to see the entire sentence because now I'm thinking about it as a whole.
With nouns. A noun.
And again, when they get to the point where even that becomes a little bit too easy for them, they can take it off entirely.
Names a person, place.
And just have the audio on its own as well. And with that audio feature, They can rewind it by 10 seconds as well, and they can click onto an individual word and just have that word read aloud to them.
Describing if you...
So if there is a particular word that they struggle with, they have that constant pronunciation. And that is probably the best feature that you're going to be able to come in and use as that starting point with your students. Now I'm just going to come out of the book by clicking exit to go back to the home screen. And just click back on the myON logo and you'll see, even for that very little time that we spent in the book, I have that 1 minute calculated. Okay, now last thing I'm going to show you just before we finish this first short webinar is one report that you can use to track that your students are using myON after you first introduce them to these recommended books. So I'm logging out and I'm now going to log in as a teacher. And you get a slightly different view as you're now analysing your students' data. But when you click onto Classroom at the top, you'll see you have a tab that's called Reports. And the best report that you can use in the launch of myON is the core report, because this gives you a fantastic overview of how your students are accessing myON. So you will have your students selected. You can then put in the date range that we are looking at. So it could be your first 2 weeks, your first month of using myON. And then we just click on the run report and we get instant feedback and instant data as to how our students are performing. So I can see how many students are included, how many books my students have read, how many pages, what that equates to as minutes, and how that breaks down over the days. So my students have spent 4% of the time since the 1st of July reading. They're averaging about 7 pages a week, and they're averaging just over 1.5 minutes a week, as well as their average Lexile. But I also get that information for the individual in a graph format. Now again, you can choose which of these columns you find important and which one you would like to order this table by. So it could be that actually you want to look at how many minutes your students are reading, because that's what's important for you in the launch, because it's slightly fairer than how many books or pages that they've necessarily read. I click this column once, it shows me the smallest figure first. I click it a second time and it shows me the highest figure first. And I can see that student 18 has read over 169 minutes in that time frame. But I can also change it and maybe look at how many books they've actually completed versus books that they have just clicked into and then clicked out of. But any report you can also download into a CSV file at the bottom to make it a slightly more user-friendly format if you prefer working in Excel. If I go back to reports, another really nice one to use when you first start is this most popular books. Because again, you're going to have certain students that maybe aren't quite sure where to start, even with their recommended tab. So what you can do by looking at this report, again using your date ranges, is you can actually say, well, these are my most read titles across the school. So actually, I'm going to make a display of these. These are the books that I'm going to recommend to my students who come in and say, I don't know what to read this week. and you can always change it from most read to looking at non-fiction, and also looking at just fiction as well, depending on what that student in particular is interested in. Now, that is everything that we're going to cover in this first session. We're going to go a little bit more in depth into how you can actually use this in the classroom in the second recording. But thank you very much for listening to this one.